Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and today it's my distinct pleasure to have Lee Benson with us. Lee is the founder and CEO of Execute to Win, also known as ETW. It helps organizations improve results through better alignment, decisions, and accountability. Over Lee's 40 years as a successful entrepreneur, he developed his powerful yet practical approach called the most important number and drivers, or mind methodology, MIND. Lee, it's so great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So I would love to start by hearing a bit about your origin story because you built a really successful, pretty large business. Then you ended up pivoting at some point to what you're doing now, and I'd love to hear what that trajectory involved.
Sure. So my first business actually was in the 80s. I was in a rock and roll band, so I employed a sound crew, light crew. We had a manager booking us constantly. We played over 300 nights a year in different clubs and a lot of originals, but also covers to kind of pay the bills. But it was a full blown business, if you will. And then from there, I had this opportunity in the early '90s to buy this small electroplating shop that was servicing aerospace companies, and took that thing from 3 employees, and I bought it for just its debt. It was about $600,000 in debt. Assumed the debt personally, and then grew that to a pretty big global aerospace aftermarket business. We repaired, overhauled, and manufactured aircraft parts for about 2,000 customers in 60 countries around the world. And along the way, I think the biggest challenge for every business out there is how do you get everybody fully aligned and organized and going the same direction. So many different gurus and leaders will talk about this out there. Really easy to say, super hard to do. Like, how do you get everybody fully aligned around the work they can do to improve what's most important? And then how do they make the best decisions about doing the right work at the right time in the right order? And then how do you build that culture of accountability where everybody's doing what they said they would, when they said they would? And then just strengthening that over time. And my experience says there's no end to how well you can do that. So that was really my first business was a band, but I've had I'm on my seventh company now. I've started from scratch, and all the way along, I just see there's no end to how well you can improve alignment, decisions, and accountability.
Right. And so you ended up creating a methodology for growing and eventually, I guess, selling a business. And what would be the kind of before and after examples that you could share that maybe give some numbers to it and you know, allows our listener to understand a bit more about the scope and the benefits?
Yeah, it's a really big question. So I remember getting to 50 employees and thinking, wow, this is great. I'm having a lot of fun, but I'm working 80 hours a week or more, and I'm doing this years on end. There has to sort of be a better way. And over time, I got much better at aligning all the employees to quality, cost, delivery, safety, whatever the metrics were. Um, but what I realized is that the right leader can make just about anything work. And so I remember fast forward to about 2011, I had 2 or 3 dozen of my CEO friends in different peer advisor groups say, "We want your results because we're knocking it out of the park and we're growing really fast." And I said, "Sure, I'll show you what we're doing." And they came in, I walked them through, and they said, "Well, we want to do this." I said, "Great." So I met with their leadership teams, and I even had a software company at the time said, "You can use our software. This is how we're aligning the employees. This is what we're doing." And after a couple of years, there were 2 left standing still doing it, but not nearly as well as they should have. And the ones where it didn't work, they didn't say that it was the process. They felt bad. They didn't have the drive, the initiative to keep this thing going. It just takes a lot of discipline. And that's where I realized, hey, the right leader can make anything work. And with that person in the room, it always works. And so every time you read a book, could be a book that Jack Welch wrote or in H.E. Lafley, any star out there that got amazing results. The reason they got the results is because it was that leader that was doing it. And so then I set out on this journey. If this works for me, but won't work for everybody else because they don't seem to have the discipline and drive to do it, what will work for 80% of teams, even when a star isn't in the room? And so that's where I set out on this journey to figure out, what is the solution for that. And I believe with the mind methodology, we've actually come up with it. And most operating systems, and there's a lot of popular ones out there, and I applaud any honest effort to improve or accelerate the value that an organization creates, whether you use scaling up or 40x or OKRs or EOS or any of the popular operating systems out there. The challenge with most of them, when a star isn't in the room, they make process more important than what is most important. And it's sort of interesting. I met with a gentleman that has about 25 companies in his portfolio, pretty wealthy, private investor, and he just said it's interesting. We use a lot of those different operating systems, and what ends up happening is everybody in the company is winning, but the company isn't going anywhere because they made it about the process and setting goals a certain way that they were assured that they would, look good with their goals, but it didn't really forward the company. So that's where the mind methodology came from. How do we get everybody making decisions and taking actions 100% designed to improve what's most important for the organization?
Hmm. Now, you mentioned a number of these operating systems or methodologies that compete with Execute to Win. And several of the folks that you've mentioned their methodologies have been guests on this podcast. And so I want to just bring one example forward, and I'd love to hear kind of a compare and contrast, not to throw anybody under the bus, but so that we can, as the outsider, understand a bit more about, let's say, EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System, and how it differs from Execute to Win. Because, for example, I can't give the name of the organization, but it's one that we both know. I didn't get permission to share the name, but they switched from EOS to ETW this year. And that really piqued my interest because I think very highly of this organization. And I was curious to hear why they did that. So maybe from your perspective, which I know is biased, but it's a very informed perspective, I'd love to hear what are the differences and why ETW over EOS?
Yeah, I would say our competition, and I think this is true for EOS if you want to use this example, is any honest effort to accelerate the value an organization creates. And EOS can work. They all can work if a star is in the room driving it, making the decisions. And I think one of the fundamental problems or challenges with most operating systems out there, and I don't feel like I'm biased here. I love everybody going after trying to improve how organizations perform. I'm really fascinated by all of this, and I believe I'm a real student of it.
Hmm.
But one of the fundamental challenges with most operating systems is they use some form of traditional goal setting. And so we'll say at the top, we want to make X amount of profit, or if you're a nonprofit, it could be having a certain amount of impact on the world because we exist. And then we want to cascade that down all the way to the front line. So everybody create goals that's going to be in support of that. Now, traditional goal setting has a really hard time standing the test of time. And I've audited hundreds and hundreds of organizations and their goals. And as you start going from the top and getting closer to the front line, um, I've never seen a case where even 10% of the total goals were really thoughtful goals that made a lot of sense to support what's going on at the top. And that's the challenge with it. And so every quarter come up with one or three goals that's going to move the needle, and then get it approved by your manager, rinse and repeat. Think about how that feels for everybody after 6 months, a year, 5 years, going through it. Really painful. Most of them don't understand it. EOS is at least a little bit easier to get your head around than something like OKRs. I see a lot of leaders that get really excited about the concepts, the objectives, and key results, and this is how it works. But ask anybody else as you go down through the organization exactly what does that mean and how does it all thread together, and you don't get very good answers. So I think one of the biggest fundamental challenges is traditional goal setting. So now when we go over to the MIND methodology, most important number and drivers, I believe teams like to work as a team. If we're playing a football game, there's the score. We know whether we're winning or losing the game. There's tons of other measures that we'll look at that will lead up to it, but there's no question as to whether we're winning or losing, and everybody's focused on that number. So with the MIND methodology, at the top of the organization, they'll come up with a most important number. It could be net positive cash flow, could be net profit, whatever you call that. And then as you go down towards the front line, every senior leader will have a team. It could be HR, finance, supply chain, operations, et cetera. Each of those teams will actually come up with a most important number that says above all others, this says we're creating the value we were designed to create, and tells us again above all others whether we're winning or losing the game. We might measure 15 or 20 other things because they're important. They all lead to improving that number, but we all agreed on that's the number, and we're focused on improving it. So the team comes up with it, and then the team comes up with categories of work that they should be really good at in order to improve that number. And then they rank how good they are today at it. And then they constantly take actions around certain of these categories, which I'll call drivers. Constantly take actions there to improve how well they leverage it to improve their most important number. So now you've created a team sport. You've helped them do something they already want to do. You've made them feel successful because it actually works really well. And now it's a team sport. Everybody isn't constantly setting a bunch of individual goals. The team gets together. There's the number. We're going after it. We're hitting it. Um, um, Definitely making it easy with the software that we put together to help them, organize all of it. And I think that's one of the other challenges, and I've heard this with EOS clients, where maintaining all of this stuff. If you've got it just working well with a senior team, that's one thing, and they're maintaining it in Google Docs and Microsoft Documents, and it's all over the place. It's in emails and Slack. It's everywhere. But as you start to cascade it down, it's hard enough to hold it together at the top. It becomes virtually impossible from a discipline standpoint to keep this thing going. And so the MIND methodology, it really makes it a team sport, and doesn't allow for people to run off and make decisions to do things that don't improve what's most important.
Right. Now, this is something I'm not quite clear about because I have not implemented the MIND methodology in my own business yet. But is that most important number a company-wide single number, or does each department have their own most important number that they have identified as the needle that they can most move, being in that department? And it seems like there's some sort of kind of overarching number that gives visibility to the entire company on whether the company is being successful or not. And I'm thinking of the term open book management and the Great Game of Business, the book by Jack Stack, where he popularizes that methodology or approach. And I remember they had a number that was on a big billboard or LED display or something that was on the shop floor, that was everywhere, that everyone could see, from the janitor all the way up. And that number, I think, was maybe the number of remanufactured engines or machines or something that they had to build that month in order to hit profitability, or something like that. And he took that company and turned it around and made it hugely successful, and came up with the whole methodology and everything in this process. So that was a company-wide number. But I'm not sure if what you're proposing is a company-wide number or it's a departmental number or a team-based number. And there are, of course, different teams inside of an organization. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I believe it was a Springfield Renew Center was the name of the company in the book, but it's
Yes.
been a while since I've read it. But there was a number for the company at the top, and every team would have a number as well as you went through it. So he made it really granular as he went through. With the MIND methodology, there is a number for the company. So it could be cash flow or profit. Let's just stay in the for profit world for this example. And then if you go down, and then every other team below that, below the senior team that has the one number for the overall organization, they will come up with their own number, and it most of the time is different than the number at the top. So if you were to say, HR, finance, or supply chain, what would be their most important number? And then as you went to teams that were, continually cascading to the front line from there, what would their most important number be? So for HR, what would that number be? And, my favorite number for HR, and this is assuming you've got, 50 or more employees, and our clients range from 4 employees to 40,000 employees. And we map these most important numbers from the top all the way to the front line. And within seconds, you can see what their number is, the work they're doing to improve it, the decisions that they're making, and all of it. And it all maps together. For HR, my favorite, most important number is percent seats filled with capable people. If you have 100 employees and 10 seats are vacant and 10 seats have people in it that aren't achieving the outcome-based responsibilities they signed up for, then you're running at 80%. And it's interesting to listen to, departments come up with initial most important number, guesses. HR would say, well, it's retention. So like, okay, well, let's keep everybody forever, and we'll have a company with 50 or 60% of the folks that shouldn't be here, and our competitors will run us over. So coming up with that ideal most important number for each of the teams, really important, and they have to go through that process of coming up with it. If I went to finance, finance, I would argue that their most important number most of the time would be net positive cash flow, because their job is to provide information to everybody in the organization to help them make better decisions to drive profitability and cash flow and improve that. And most of the time, senior leaders in finance will have these amazing reports. They go out to everybody. And so the first thing I'll do when we work with a new client, and the CFO will be really proud of these amazing reports that nobody understands. I go talk to all the senior leaders, and then I talk to each of the other leaders throughout the organization within reason and ask them, how are you using that information to make better decisions to improve profitability and or cash flow? And most of the time, they don't have anything. And so that's a pretty epic failure for the finance department. Their job is to have these discussions with leaders to help them discover what the numbers are that will allow them to make better decisions to drive that kind of stuff. And every single team has a most important number. Even the teams that will often say, well, we're different. We can't have one number. Well, you might have 50 numbers, but there is one that says above all others, you're winning or losing the game. And if you were to put all of your family's retirement money into it, you would be comfortable knowing you're getting a return or not.
This makes me think about how I learned there are really two ways that a business can go out of business. One is the heart attack, and the other is the slow death, like essentially a cancer. Running on a business that has, let's say, not enough cash in the bank, so not enough net positive cash flow, is the heart attack. And profitability being not where it should be, that's the slow death, that's the cancer. So if you run a business where it's profitable, but you have these swings in cash flow and you don't have enough money to pay your team, and they get nervous and they leave, well, that's the end. So that's something that stuck with me. I don't want my business to die of a surprise heart attack. I've got to watch the cash flow, but I also need to watch the profitability of the business, and they're pretty different from each other. So profit, I think, is something that is given way too much attention in comparison to cash flow, and I'm curious if that's also your take on it.
Well, I think the most important number in any organization that's probably any organization, even the nonprofit side, is cash flow. If you can't pay payroll and pay your bills, you've got a real problem. But you have to think about the type of business. So when I was in the aerospace business, it was wildly capital intensive. Tens of millions of dollars in new equipment we were buying each year, and inventory supporting aircraft systems globally, had inventory actually pre-positioned all over the planet. There was a lot of money tied up in that, and that's cash. So it would be really easy in that scenario for us to be wildly profitable and then go out of business because there was no cash to pay for any of it. And so you really have to watch it. But in a pure service business, I mean, let's just say a consulting business, your net profit pretty much follows cash flow, going through. So it just depends. Are you capital intensive? Yes or no, and you have to watch it. But cash flow, I think, is it's the only number that can't be gamed, and if you run out, you're in big trouble, right? But if you go to sell the company, often EBITDA is what you would be going after. So we want to optimize that as we go forward too. And then I've got a number of friends that, hey, they optimized EBITDA, but they had so much debt when they sold the company. Once you satisfy the debt, there wasn't a whole lot of money left over for the founders to, get that reward.
Yeah. Yeah. So for our listener who's unfamiliar with the term EBITDA, could you describe that?
Earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the number that you take a multiple of, and that's what the company is worth if you go to sell it, typically, right?
Yeah, yeah, and every industry is different. If you had $1 million in EBITDA, it could be 8 times that, it could be 12 times that, and my biggest sale was north of 20 times that number.
It's awesome. All right.
Which is awesome, and so that's another I think great point. If someday you're positioning the organization to sell, what are the conditions that will cause the highest multiple of EBITDA or whatever that number is that you're going to be selling it based on?
Hmm.
And when I sold my aerospace company, actually combined three into one and sold it, we were positioned incredibly well. Great leadership team, strong record of growth, positioned to grow into the future, could leverage the strategic buyers channels, all of that. How well you're run. So if we're talking about getting optimized, organized with some kind of an operating system that's intentional, the better you can demonstrate that, the higher the multiple. At the time that I sold the aerospace company, most strong aerospace companies that were in the aftermarket, similar in size to us, were getting maybe an 8x multiple, and we went way above and beyond that. And I would say it's because of the operating system that we had and how that positioned us for future success. And an equally good, if not better, option for me at the time would have been keeping the company.
So why didn't you keep the company?
A lot of so I own the majority of the stock, and I controlled all of it. If anybody were to leave the company, they'd have to sell it back to the company. But a lot of the folks wanted to get an exit, and I said, "Great, we'll do this." And then I'm going to go this other direction, which I'm really fascinated by, which is execute to win, or ETW, right now.
Mm-hmm. Now,
Yeah.
there's a methodology called Value Builder by John Warrillow. He's the author of Built to Sell. He was a guest a while back on this podcast, and the metrics and drivers that grow the value of the business, allowing it to sell for a higher multiple and for ultimately a much bigger number, is the basis for his system. So I'm curious, how does a system like that compare to an everyday kind of, I just need to grow and scale the business, whether I decide to sell it or to hand it over to my kids someday or whatever.
Yeah, I think the goal should be, and I think it's great that there's people doing the work that you're describing out there. It's so important, and so many people miss it. But I think at any point in time, we should be positioning our companies to sell for the highest possible amount of money and real value, not just sort of a bunch of band-aids on something to make it look like it's pretty good. But at any point in time, we should be doing that because we don't know what could happen in our lives. There's a lot of things that could happen. I could get hit by a bus tomorrow, and then what do you do with all that, and what is it worth, and what about all of the team members that helped you get there, et cetera. So I think no matter what, we should be focused on that.
Hmm.
And a big part of that, in my view, is thinking about strategic buyers, and that's what we were doing. And I had my eye on a number of folks out there for quite a few years before we ended up selling the company. That if they were to buy us, even at 20x, it would literally be like they bought us for 4x because of how they can leverage us in their channels.
Right. So a strategic buyer sees so much more value in acquiring the company than just the numbers that would appeal to, let's say, a private equity firm.
Yeah. If I'm a private equity buyer and I see something that's got a nice growth rate and they've got this return going on and I buy them, that's all I really have. I hope I can build on that. I'm a strategic buyer. I look at it and say, all I have to do is add that product or service or lines, whatever it is, to my channels, and it can grow 5x within 3 years or something like that. Then it becomes a win-win for both parties in a big way.
Yeah. You mentioned the getting hit by a bus analogy. So, what happened in your life and your businesses that was a getting hit by a bus moment that ended up being actually a great blessing in hindsight?
Well, there's sort of metaphorical buses for the business itself, right?
Right.
Which is what we're talking about. I was talking about what if something happened to me,
Right. But
and
there are
I so
probably, some overlaps there where it's a key person in your business who ended up, getting sick or dying or having to leave for personal reasons or just got bored or tired and chose a different path and you weren't ready for it or, so there different kinds of,
yeah,
as you say, metaphorical getting hit by a bus moments,
yeah.
and some of them we can see how, in hindsight, they were hugely beneficial for us. So I'm curious to hear any stories.
Yeah, I've always thought that we should position our companies that if something happened to us, the founder, it could keep going. Like we could come back, 3 years later and look at it and be really surprised at how well they're doing. And so I think that's really important. As I built my aerospace company, which was the largest so far, north of 500 employees, fairly large, good size, mid-sized business. But as I built that, I changed the leadership team out literally 5 times
Hmm.
along the way, and we just sort of outgrew their capability, et cetera. And in the early days with 50 employees, I'm spending 80 hours a week doing this, having a blast. And at the end, I'm spending maybe 15 hours a week running this thing, and it's growing faster than ever. And it's because of how the whole thing was set up. What's that saying? You want to be important, but not necessary. And so I think that's important just from a positioning standpoint. But I'd say one of the biggest metaphorical, hit by the bus, business situation we ran into was when 9/11 happened. So we're repairing and overhauling aircraft parts for aircraft operators globally, both helicopter and fixed wing, all commercial. And now everybody's grounded, and so that following year, I mean, there was some flights going on, but any aircraft that needed maintenance, they parked the aircraft. And so there were hundreds and hundreds of competitors going out of business right and left. And we had a month where there was virtually no business. Everybody shut everything off, canceled purchase orders, all of it. It was quite a shock. So how do we get through this? And we sat back and said, okay, well, what's the best way to leverage it? And we went to some of the aircraft operators, primarily helicopter operators, and they were significantly down. Some of the oil and gas folks flying out to the rigs, and we said, well, how about we take over your maintenance department? You don't have to maintain all of the people and equipment and everything in there, and we'll hire some of your folks. And we ended up picking up all these different programs and grew that year where most of our competitors shrank significantly or went out of business. So there's always a way if you're positioned for it and you're being really smart, strategically. And I've always thought that even if the available business were to be cut in half at any point in time, we could still figure out a way to grow like crazy because there's still a lot of work out there. You just have to be very creative about how you do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No, and one thing that is important for kind of future-proofing your business is having enough capital available so that you can seize opportunities like that instead of just being on the brunt of it, like all the competition who wasn't prepared. So having capital available before you need it is really important. So what sort of advice do you have around that?
Yeah. Well, like they say, when you can borrow money, you should. So having the credit lines in place and everything else, super important. But that at that time, that kind of freaked the banks out too, because where you're going to borrow a bunch of money, what's going to happen here is it's just a lifeline until it goes away in 6 months or something like that. So I agree, super important. I also believe there's a lot of ways to do things that don't require a ton of capital. So as I grew that aerospace business, never once did I take outside investment money ever. The first year our capex budget was $175. We did 330,000 in sales, and almost went out of business 15 times.
Hmm.
And then the last year our capex is $36 million, and we did all of that cashing ourselves, never with any outside investment. So you can be really smart about it. Even had, especially early on, everybody wanted to barter and work with us. We had people that would give us facilities to use if we would just trade to do some work for them. There's always a way to figure it out, working with suppliers and customers out there to make it work. Doesn't have to be, here's a pile of cash. If you have it, you're going to be great. If you don't, you're not going to be great. There's always a way. And I think our job as leaders is to find that way, even if we don't know what it is today.
Yeah. Now, in some cases, having that cash available, like let's say you take out an SBA loan or something like that, is detrimental to the health of the business because then you get complacent and you're not running a lean machine. You're just putting off the inevitable because you're not motivated enough, you're not hungry enough to make sure there's enough new business coming in the door. So do you have any examples of that where somebody perhaps wasn't hungry enough because they had too much capital available and then they ended up running aground?
Yeah, having less money makes you way smarter and faster. When you have the money, you'll do things without really thinking through. And I see a lot of early stage companies make this mistake, and those are my favorite companies to work with through ETW. And the mistake that they typically make is doing things required to scale before they have something that will actually scale. And so, hey, we just got all this money. Let's put in a big marketing team and let's put all this other stuff in place. And they don't have a product or service that's proven yet. And so I would say, in those cases, pour everything into proving what will actually have scalable traction before you do steps, 3, 4, and 5 going in. But that can be huge. And I've watched companies just blow through millions and millions of dollars and could have done it completely different, would a whole different outcome.
Hmm. In a case like that, what would be the most important number for marketing? Where let's say they haven't honed in on the right product that's scalable or service, and so they're just throwing money into a fire. Perhaps what would a most important number for marketing that would help to right the ship, what would that be?
Yeah. Well, the question here would be, what am I marketing if I don't have anything yet that can scale? So there is no number for marketing, in my view, in the
Mm,
scenario that you're throwing out.
got it.
The most important number for the organization would be what's the measure of the thing we're trying to observe to get traction, having something that will actually scale. And so that that example could be it could be weekly active users if it's a software type company, for a service. But if we have a product, what who are the focus groups or test groups that we're working with to determine whether or not this thing is going to go? And so the most important number has to be what's happening right there and getting it to that next step. And then once you figure out what works, then you can pour some fuel on it and keep going, but always iterating to improve the perceived value of the product or service. But everything has to be there, and that's really hard work to live right there. It's way easier just to, as they say, play house and set up the marketing team and hire the CFO and do all of this stuff and be perceived like you're playing this game, like all the people that made it did at some point. But I would say all those that made it would come back and say, what are you doing? You need to figure out what's going to get scalable traction here before you do all that other stuff.
Yeah, but then conventional wisdom is that you get the right people and the right team, and you can turn anything around. You could have a terrible product and still win, but if you have a great product and a mediocre team, you're doomed to failure.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, if you get the right team in place, they'll do the right work.
Hmm.
Like they'll surround it. But if I hired a CFO, marketing leader, and all of these really strong pedigree leaders on the team, and they all start doing their thing in their area of expertise without zeroing in on what's the thing that we're supporting and how do we make sure that's right so everything else grows, then it will fail. And I've seen some pretty high end pedigree teams put together, and the companies fail and they burn through tens of millions of dollars because they didn't solve for what will actually scale.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, if the product or service is terrible, you could have a great team. It looks like a short-term win because they positioned and had the relationships, but then it always tanks. You have to get the product or service right at some point.
Yeah. Do you have an example of that where it was an incredible pedigree team and it was a spectacular failure?
Boy, there's a few that I can't quite think of, but there's been some pretty public examples of that where here's the new darling of Wall Street, and then it just completely crashes. It could be, what was the blood testing company? I
Oh,
forget their CEO's name.
yeah. So Theranos or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was it, Theranos. And so examples like that. Look at all this hype. Look how amazing it's going to be. We
Yeah.
did a great job marketing, and then there was nothing there,
Yeah. Oh,
and away
Elizabeth
it went.
Holmes, that's her name.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And some cautionary tales from the .com eras of like boo.com and what was it, pets.com, the sock puppet and all that. Like that's
Yeah.
there are lots of those kind of case studies.
I
So
don't. I don't think it's about. I don't think it's about. It shouldn't be about. Hey, look how much money this thing made. It should be about how much value are we creating in the world.
mm, yes.
And if we're passionate about creating value in the world, then great. Then the money and all the other stuff will kind of follow, and let's keep building on that, and not idolize folks because they just made a ton of money.
Yeah. Speaking of that kind of end game of creating value or doing something that leaves the world better than we found it, what's your massively transformational purpose or MTP? Using this term from Peter Diamandis, like what drives you to build businesses, grow them, sell them, do the stuff that excites you every day.
Yeah, I believe in the work that we're doing, that we're really strengthening communities by improving workplace cultures. people are having more fun, they're more engaged. These great things are permeating out into their families, their communities. And I believe that if you're part of a healthy community that has your back, we don't even need government, because no matter what, we're going to take care of each other and make it go. So I think that's wildly important, to get it right. And what would be different at the end of everybody's lives if, from a value creation standpoint, they were net positive from a material, emotional, and spiritual standpoint. One more dollar, one more unit of each of the others, what would this world be like? It would be incredible. To me, it's like what's the purpose of an education? It's to create value in the world. And I go back to material, emotional, and spiritual.
Mm.
And that's not how we talk about it. It's like, get your diploma and then get your degree and then, take this next step. Like, back to process is more important than what's most important. We're learning to be able to create value in the world, not be some part of some special elite class, that has this particular degree, or part of, whatever club. What did they say? Our customers aren't buying pedigree of the people that work at the companies they're buying products or services from. They're buying perceived value.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think we should really be focusing on that. And I realized it as I was building my largest company, that just watching the community and how they had each other's backs. Never once did I ever have a leader quit, ever. Retention really high. All the people we wanted, always stayed. Stars wanted to come work for us. Well, why was that? And we weren't out there trying to win all the awards to be the best company, to work for in the valley or the state or whatever. We just were. And then you watched all that stuff happen.
Mm. Amazing. Now, I'm familiar with the concept called triple bottom line, and how that's about not just the financial impact that you're creating in the value creation that you're doing, but also the environmental impact, the externalities that are oftentimes ignored by some of the more ruthless CEOs, and social impacts as well. But you mentioned something that I really want to hone in on, and which is the spiritual impact, and being net positive from a spiritual standpoint. Could you elaborate more on that?
So for me, I'm not very religious, but I would say I'm spiritual. I feel connected to something. And so I think there's only up or down, and you want to go in a positive direction. So, more love, higher level of consciousness, all of that, grow that over time. Don't go the other direction. And it's pretty easy to go the other direction for a lot of folks. Just watch the, mainstream media and how it just sort of takes people down this swirl. From an emotional standpoint, it's when you're in the room, be the person that gives everybody energy. From a spiritual standpoint, set the example of always trying to raise your level of consciousness, if you will, and get other people to think about that and move in that direction.
Mm. Did you have some sort of spiritual epiphany or awakening, or some sort of without a doubt sign, some sort of pivotal event in your life that made you reevaluate the physical reality of this life?
Uh, for me, there wasn't any one thing. It was just sort of starting down a road and then realizing that's the only road to be on.
Hmm.
And when I'm not intentionally working on it, I don't feel nearly as good as when I actually am.
Yeah. Awesome.
I don't even feel like we can get to a level and stay there. I think we're either sliding back a little bit or we're going forward, and so that's why we have to keep working on it.
Yeah, as Tony Robbins says, you're either growing or you're dying, and I believe that's the case, not just for people, but for businesses, for economies, for cultures, for communities, everything.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with Tony.
Yeah. So let's talk about culture. There's this idea of a culture of accountability that you spoke about briefly earlier in this conversation, and I'd love to hear more about that. What's a culture of accountability feel like? Not just look like, because they've got their most important numbers and they're hitting their numbers and people are holding themselves accountable or being accountable or being held accountable. So
Yeah.
what does that feel like to be in that kind of an organization? And maybe the best organization example I could give comes to mind of an incredible culture is Zappos. And it just is, it permeates the company. And to the point where they even have culture books that people contribute to, employees put their stories in and so forth. And there are themed conference rooms that are really cute and funny and clever. And it's just, it feels like a family. Yeah. So I'm curious to hear
Yeah.
your take on all that.
Culture to me is interesting. Most folks, when they talk about culture, they just say it feels good. Like we have a great culture. It feels amazing. It feels like family. Well, what's the purpose of having a really healthy culture inside of an organization, and how do you intentionally design it? And I think culture is basically the value that comes from the core beliefs, the decisions, the practices, and the accountability foundationally in any organization out there. Those are the things from which they create value. And when I think in particular about accountability, think about organizational trust, and what does that really mean? And there's a number of folks out there that we would say, well, we trust them; they can come watch our kids, but I don't trust them in the company to do what they said they would. And when everybody's doing what they said they would, when they said they would, and if they can't, they're giving you plenty of notice and workarounds before the deadline. Now we completely trust them. And so, culture of accountability is it's a culture of organizational trust.
Mm. That reminds me of a question that I learned to ask in interviews. I learned it from my friend Sam Zertok, and it's well, I will tell you what the name of the test is afterwards, because otherwise it'll give it away. So the question goes something like this: so, given the role, your understanding of the role, what do you consider to be the most important attribute of the five that I'm going to give you? Let's say dedication, technical acumen, creativity, honesty, attention to detail. So put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's being interviewed. What would be your answer?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because for me, what's most important is the end result that we want to get. And sometimes it might require creativity, it could require a number of things. But at the end of the day, what are the outcomes this role is responsible for? And that's going to be what's most important. And depending on the scenario, I would pick one of the five.
Mm. Well, that's interesting because my friend Sam told me there's only one right answer, and it's always the same, and it's honesty. So he calls it the honesty test.
Honesty. Okay,
Because
interesting.
you can't
Yeah.
train honesty into somebody. It's an innate value or virtue. And if somebody is all about telling you what they think you want to hear, and it's like, oh, well, attention to detail, that's for sure going to be the number one uh, attribute for this role because of X, Y, and Z. Well, they think that that's what I want to hear, but I actually wanted to hear honesty, but I wanted to hear it in the context of that's truly their answer, not because they're trying to look good or not look bad, but because that's who they are. That's how they show up in the world. And a lot of folks I've passed over because I've interviewed them, I've asked them the question, and then they gave that answer that was not the honesty answer. And I'm like,
Mm.
doesn't feel right. It doesn't
Yeah.
feel genuine. It doesn't feel like there's a vibrational match.
Yeah. Honesty just feels like a ticket to play.
Yeah, yeah. It's table stakes.
Yeah.
I remember so many times where different staff over the years, and I've employed many staff over the years, not like thousands, but you know, hundreds, I guess. And
Hmm.
like I'd walk up to somebody and she would not realize that her computer monitor's reflection was shining through the window behind her, so I could see what she was doing as I was walking up to her, and she'd be zipping up windows as I'm walking up every time. And I never challenged her on that or anything, because that wasn't really something I wanted to do at the time to, I don't know, shake things up. I had a general manager who was in charge of the culture and the team and everything, and he really should have done something about it, I thought, but he didn't. He chose not to look the other way, and I ended up doing the same thing. But that gets noticed not just by the upper management, but by the person's peers, and then that creates a culture of complacency, a culture of I'm going to, cut corners or not act in integrity. And that's one of the things that the honesty test is looking to avoid, having those people in the organization in the first place.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I know we're running up to time here. So if our listener wanted to implement the mind methodology, most important numbers and drivers, number and drivers, or just overall the entire ETW system, execute to win, what would be a good first step? Would they work with your organization? Would they just pick up a book or an online training? What would be a good next step? And for those who want to work directly with you, is that even an option?
Yeah, it is. And I would say go to etw.com. You can learn a lot about this. If you want to download a high level mind methodology playbook, you can go to maxyourmin.com, maxyourmin.com, and download that playbook. And this is designed to where any team can do it. And like I said in the beginning, I designed it to where I wanted at least 80% of all teams anywhere to be able to do this, even when a star isn't in the room. So you can DIY for sure, but it always goes faster with one of our certified consultants working with you.
Right. Awesome. And how expensive is the investment to work with a consultant on this?
Yeah, it depends on what the organization wants, but we typically engage for a full year with the senior leadership team, and then it can cascade out from there. And we're in the room, usually virtually, for the first 8 meetings, and then once a month for the remainder of a year. And then there's lots of sort of configuration and training and development stuff going on between the meetings. But depending on the size of the company, that price can move around a bit. But we typically engage by team and work with a senior team and then like a few additional teams. And at some point, and very quickly, they can self-serve their own teams.
Gotcha. And your personal website to follow you and maybe hire you to speak or something like that would be leejbenson.com.
That's correct.
All right. Awesome. Well, Lee, this was a real pleasure and very enlightening and inspiring. And wow, what a great mission you've been on and you continue to be on. So thank you for all the light you reveal in the world.
All right. Well, thanks, Stephan. I really appreciate you taking the time with me today.
Awesome. And thank you, listener, for taking the time to listen and to play full out, not just use this as entertainment or edutainment, but to actually listen with the intention of applying it in your life. And we'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.